Jenny Gibbs, Executive Director of the IFPDA and the IFPDA Foundation. Welcome to Day 3 of Print Month, our celebration of all things print. For the full calendar of events, please visit our website at ifpda.org. Today we have Prints in Relief, Print Study Day. Print Study Day is at the very heart of Print Month, what used to be Print Week. It's a long-standing annual event organized by the Department of Drawings and Prints at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, in conjunction with the IFPDA Fair, which will open online on October 15th and return to the Javits Center next October. The IFPDA and I are tremendously grateful to our moderator today, Nadine Orenstein, Drew Hines, curator in charge of the Department of Drawings and Prints at the Met, and her colleagues Jennifer Farrell and Constance McPhee for organizing this program. I would also like to thank our speakers today, Sylvia Urbini, Melanie Herzog, and Rachel Mustalish, who will be introduced more fully by Nadine, to whom I now pass the microphone, so to speak. Thank you.
Hello and welcome, and thanks so much, Jenny. And I really want to thank Jenny and Sherry Young and the IFPDA in general for being longtime collaborators with us on this annual event, which we also look forward to every year. I also want to thank Jennifer Farrell and Constance McPhee for organizing this session. And of course, thank you to all the speakers who are promising to give us a lively and interesting series of talks today. Now, as you may know, in the pre-pandemic era, we held this event in person in the Metropolitan Museum in our auditorium. And while that held certain advantages, we are delighted that this format allows us to include speakers from Europe and other parts of the country and to welcome audiences from all around the world. And at the moment, we have 199 people, many more people than could ever be accommodated in the Met Sacerdote Auditorium. So welcome to you all. The title of our session today is Prints in Relief, on the theme of relief prints. Our speakers will represent a range of perspectives and approaches on the theme of relief prints, woodcuts and lino cuts, to offer insights into old master woodcuts as well as the media's use by modern and contemporary artists. Now, the topic was chosen to accompany our upcoming exhibition called Modern Times, which is an exhibition of British modernist prints from the collection of Leslie and Joanna Garfield that the Met acquired, I guess, 2 years ago at this point. The exhibition opens on November 1st, and we'll have a soft opening the previous weekend. There is a lovely catalog. So I hope that those of you in the city will be able to come see it. And certainly many of the prints can be consulted online now, and also order the catalog. So here is how we're going to organize the session today. In the interest of time, I will introduce all of our speakers before the first talk. You can post your questions for the speakers in the chat, and you may do so during the lectures as well as during the Q&A session, which will take place at the end after the final talk. So I will moderate the Q&A questions, please type them into the chat, and you probably won't be able to see them, but be assured that I will be able to see them as well as the panelists. So let me start by introducing our first speaker, Sylvia Orbini. She's a researcher and exhibition curator for the Gallerie Estensi in Modena. She's also curator in liaison with Laura Aldovini and David Landau for the Census of Italian Renaissance Woodcuts at the Giorgio Cini Foundation in Venice, and that's what she's going to talk to us about today. She received a PhD in History of Art from the University of Bologna in 2004 for her dissertation, whose title, luckily she translated in English for me, Pietro Perugino and the Divination Games in the Renaissance Courts. Her publications include a current exhibition in Modena on William Henry Fox Talbot and the origins of photography. She has published several articles relating to the findings of the census, including an article in Print Quarterly entitled A Newly Identified Woodcut by Amico Aspertini of 2018. And she has a forthcoming article on Giulio Romano's flight into Egypt and other engravings to be published in Ricerche di Storia dell'Arte in 2022. The title of her talk will be A Census of Italian Renaissance Woodcuts. Our second speaker is Melanie Herzog, who's a professor emerita of art history at Edgewood College and senior lecturer in Afro-American studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, with an emphasis on artists' encounters across cultural and geographical borders and intersections of race, ethnicity, gender, and representation. She teaches, publishes, and lectures widely on North American art and visual culture. Her publications include Elizabeth Catlett, an American artist in Mexico of 2000, Elizabeth Catlett in the Image of the People, 2005, Elizabeth Catlett in Mexico at Mid-Century, Navigating Gender and Visual Politics Across Cultural Borders, which appeared in American Women Artists, 1935 to 1970, Gender, Culture, and Politics in 2016, and My Art Speaks for Both My Peoples, Elizabeth Catlett in Mexico, in the Art of Solidarity, Visual and Performative Politics in Cold War Latin America of 2018. Her title to talk today is called To Put Art to the Service of People, Elizabeth Catlett and Prints for Black Liberation. And finally, Rachel Mustalish will be our final speaker. She is a paper conservator at the Metropolitan Museum, where she joined the staff in 1998. She received an MA in the History of Art and a Certificate of Advanced Study in Conservation from the Institute of Fine Arts and a PhD in Technical Art History from the Courtauld. She examines, treats, and studies drawings and prints from across the collection with specializations in European and American modernism, international contemporary art, and print techniques. She contributed to the catalog that I showed you a little while ago for our upcoming exhibition, Modern Times, and has upcoming publications on the collages of Juan Gris and the methods and meanings in the later work of Arthur Dove. And her talk is entitled Lino Cuts, Making and Meaning. So without further ado, I will pass you on to Sylvia Urbini to start off our program.
Okay. First of all, I should like to thank you for the invitation to present our project at the Print Study Day organized by the Department of Print and Drawings of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in association with IFPDA. I am speaking also on behalf of the other curators of the Census, Laura Aldovini and David Landau. The Census of Italian Renaissance Woodcuts is a digital archive cataloging woodcuts and woodblocks produced in Italy from the earliest known use of the medium up to around 1550. The database is freely accessible online through the website of the Fondazione Giorgio Cini in Venice and can be reached through this link. We trace, study, and catalog all the Italian single-leaf woodcuts belonging to museums, libraries, archives, and public and private collections in Italy and abroad, as well as those put up for sale over time by dealers and auction houses. We also include woodcuts preserved in more unusual places, such as prints that are still in their original location, such as churches, or those that can be found in even more unexpected places. For instance, glued onto furniture, used as wallpapers, or pasted into manuscript books. The most conspicuous difference between the Census and the internal cataloging project of individual museums is that here we gather together and compare material that is kept in different places. The result is the creation of a digital history expressed through both words and images, documenting a specific artistic technique and its development. It also means that we can gather and compare the works of an individual artist or of a specific geographical area. The purpose of the census is primarily to trace and catalog the largest possible number of woodcuts and woodblocks, so as to construct an archive as complete as possible, which is constantly updated. This is the preliminary and essential condition for pursuing our other main goals, which are to spread knowledge and appreciation of these little-known prints, which have been studied only intermittently in the past, and in view of the rarity and fragility of the material, to protect the prints through the very act of cataloging. In fact, with our encouragement, very precious woodcuts that were believed lost have been found. Most recently, a Madonna and Child with Saint from Siena, that, although it is in a fragmentary state, is extremely important because it is the closest derivation from the oldest Italian woodcut, the Madonna del Fuoco from the Cathedral of Forlì, dating to before 1328. We also committed to encouraging new research through publication, conferences such as the recent Discorso sul metodo Stampe e illustrazioni nel Rinascimento, held on the 16th of October 2020 at the Fondazione Giorgio Cini in Venice, as well as internship for university students. The platform of use for the cataloging is SICAP Web. The Fondazione Giorgio Cini uses this platform to catalog its numerous archives. It is the official platform of the Veneto Regional Authority and corresponds to the cataloging models for museum and archives designed by the Central Institute for Cataloging and Documentation of the Italian Ministry of Cultural Heritage, the ICCD. The structure of the catalog records and the terminology used are subject to continual revision to conform with the ministerial directives. The cataloging of woodblocks and woodcuts is aimed at providing a versatile, comprehensive tool suited to the specific characteristic of this unique material, as well as being geared to user needs. For this reason, while following the guidelines of the ICCD, we felt it necessary to add several fields and specifications to the existing prints and woodblocks form, and have thus created a special catalog record for woodcuts. The system is open to different modes of researching and complies with international semantic web standards. All the items, woodblocks and sheets that are retrieved and cataloged are entered in the database and assigned a code that will serve as the identification number in our census. This is preceded by the prefix ALU, an acronym from the initials of the curator's surnames Aldovini, Landau, and Urbini. A number is assigned to each separate composition, which may be known through either the carved woodblock, in which case the number is followed by -M, or through the impressions of the print deriving from it, which may be more than one, in which case the identification number is followed by 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, and so on. Every catalog entry and every image is linked to the museum or institution that possesses the print or woodblock, if the institution has an online digital catalog. A great deal of effort has been devoted to finding the images of the prints and woodblocks mentioned in the database. We have been able to acquire many images thanks to the Creative Commons policies that are increasingly followed by the museum institution, but also thanks to the generosity of many collections, libraries, archives, and auction houses that have kindly supplied them. The destined user base for our database is very large and goes well behind specialists in the sector of woodcuts and chiaroscuro. Indeed, the census is not only a contribution to Italian Renaissance art, but also more generally to the cultural history of the time. More than other kinds of prints, woodcuts were actually a part of everyday life in the Renaissance. They were object of devotion, protecting homes and workshops, and even decoration of furnishing. They were used for games, for instance, playing cards or tarot cards. They were also used in the circulation and updating of technical, historical, and geographical knowledge in the form of broadsheets and maps, and often consist of contrived assemblages of text and images. And it should also be stressed that, unlike other engravings techniques, the woodcuts were almost always inventive rather than mere reproduction. The future of the project depends on the possibility of continuing to make investigation, of cataloging new exemplars, and of sharing our material through the website and through targeted initiatives such as training courses, conference, exhibition, publication, and so on. On this note, just a few months ago, the Census was granted funding by the International Paper Project of the Getty Foundation to organize an exhibition about Italian Renaissance woodcuts. It will be the first exhibition ever on this subject. The exhibition will open at the end of 2023 at the Musei Civici di Pavia. This museum also holds the important collection of prints belonging to the Marquis Luigi Malaspina. Laura Aldovini, one of the curators of the Census, is the person in charge of this collection. Now, in the second part of my presentation, I should like to present some of the results of the research that has been carried out for the Census. To cite the title of this presentation, this is an exploration of artists and meanings, of specific case studies that bring to the fore issues of form, that is stylistic aspect, and of function, namely the destination and use of the woodcuts. This is indeed one of the particular features of these works, which, to a much greater degree than other print genres, were created to be artistically contemplated, but also had practical function. In the first place, the research carried out for the Census has made it possible to study collections that turned out to be treasure troves for Italian Renaissance prints. Firstly, that of the Kunsthalle in Bremen. This is one of Germany's most important departments of prints and drawing, but the Italian materials it conserves had never been studied. In the 19th century, a Bremen physician called Hermann Segek donated to the Kunsthalle his collection of over 2,000 woodcuts. These included some extremely important Italian works, many of them famous, but also other valuable prints that were either too unknown. We were in fact able to retrieve an unknown work by the painter, sculptor, and engraver from Bologna, Amico Aspertini. A note on the mount attributes the print to Domenico Beccafumi, but this animated nativity is a sort of handbook of Aspertini's invention. This enables us to attribute the work to the unconventional Bolognese artist with a high degree of confidence. It also permits us to date its execution to the beginning of the third decade of the 16th century in relation to other of his works, displaying stylistic and iconographical similarities. Belonging to the same collection is another large-sized woodcuts, an imaginary portrait of Miles d'Anglante. We have also retrieved portraits of other figures which altogether must have made up a series from the Carolingian circle, which in Italy then converged in the Orlando Innamorato by Matteo Maria Boiardo and Ludovico Ariosto's Orlando Furioso. These woodcuts are paratextual elements, that is supplementary to the printed text. They contain titles, caption, and short narration. They were probably used in theatrical performances and commented on by street entertainers or minstrels who, with the help of the illustration, told the story of the paladins or even of more recent historic events. This figurative transposition of literary text and tales of current historical events should be performed or sung in the square and marketplace, in the theaters, and during the numerous occasions of public and private celebration that were an important element of Renaissance life. Obviously, these productions were not involved with profane festivity only, but also with religion celebration. One of our most lucky finds relates to a particularly important work that was believed to have been lost. This is the St. John the Baptist engraved by Francesco De Nanto, one of the most important woodcut artists active in Italy in the first half of the 16th century. The sparse bibliography correctly attributes the invention of this work to the Bolognese painter Francesco Francia. The St. John records work that Francia produced around 1510, such as this other St. John the Baptist, and especially the drawing below in the infrared photo taken during the restoration. Christeller suggested that a woodcut titled Christ at the Gate of Hell, also conserved in Paris and found on the same occasion, is a pendant piece to the St. John and hence also by De Nanto. The text engraved by Francesco De Nanto in the framed square panel in the lower part of the woodcut showing St. John the Baptist was read on the eve of the Saint Feast Day on the 24th of June. The print could therefore have been commissioned by a church or a confraternity devoted to St. John and then sold to the faithful. Francesco De Nanto is one of the few engravers for whom we have several surviving woodblocks. In our research, we seek out woodblocks as well as woodcuts and catalog them in our database. And we are particularly proud of our work in searching for and cataloging these extremely rare materials. We decided to include the surviving blocks in the census because they can provide us with much information and many details about the woodcuts, even more than the print itself or than a matrix made of other material, such as copperplate. Directly or through comparison, woodblocks can reveal details that help in a more precise definition of chronology or attribution. Blocks can show whether a part of the print was altered, which composition were cut on the same block, or how the artist carved the wood. For example, let's take a woodcut conserved in the Metropolitan Museum. In the portrait of the Ottoman Corsair Barbarossa, we can see the L.A. and star monogram of the engraver Lucantonio degli Uberti. However, in the woodblock, it is clear that this monogram is on a piece of wood that was inserted later. It is in fact a forgery made by Pietro Barelli, a Milan printer who was for a time in possession of the Soliani blocks of the Galleria Estensi, of which the Barbarossa is part. Barelli also completed the missing part in the corner of the print and restored the block by hand. The New York Public Library holds an exemplar of the print prior to falsification, and many thanks to Richard Field for this photo. Another of the reasons why it is essential to catalog the woodblocks is because there are no survived woodcuts from certain blocks. This is the case of a little-known woodblock that we recently studied, and I should like to apologize for the poor quality of these images. It shows San Sebastian with his body pierced by arrow, bound to a simple pillar in an austere setting with a tile perspective pavement, which, together with the perfect design of the figure, produces a work at once simple and of extraordinary quality. Given the affinity with the San Sebastian painted by Giovanni Bellini in the San Sebastian triptych for the Church of Santa Maria della Carità in Venice, now in the Galleria dell'Accademia, we can assume that the drawing for this woodblock came from Bellini workshop, and the woodcut should be a prayer card printed by the Church of Santa Maria della Carità for the celebration of the Saint Feast Day. A mine for research into ancient prints that scholars have paid little attention today is the field of manuscript. Indeed, between the 15th and 16th century, the compilers of manuscripts were in the habit of gluing engravings on single sheets onto the pages. These sheets were not conceived for the books that they illustrate, but were inserted for various reasons by the scribe or by the owner. So our research started in the museum and in the prints and drawing departments, and then extended into libraries and archives. The most famous case is that of the manuscript compiled by a legal clerk from Parma, Jacopo Rubieri, in the second half of the 15th century, who was in the habit of decorating the codices into which he copied the legal text by gluing woodcuts into them. A total of 48 prints have been found in these manuscripts. They are among the oldest Italian woodcuts that have come down to us and are almost all unique exemplars. The insertion of engravings inside books was a fairly widespread practice. Sometimes their purpose was to illustrate or explain the accompanying text, whereas others bear witness to the devotion of the owner of the manuscript. In other cases, they were simply used for embellishment. Such prints are commonly found, for instance, in the manuscript of the historians and chroniclers of the 16th century, such as the Venetian Marine Sanudo. Sanudo collected topical prints, which he sometimes included as commentary on his news stories. In other cases, the print was the news and was included without any comment of his. Prints are included in almost all 58 volumes of his diaries. Among them, some large and valuable woodcuts, such as those illustrating the coronation of Charles the fifth in 1519, which are not included in our catalog because they are German. There were also broadsides comprising text and woodcut vignette, often representing events of a miraculous or horrific, or in any case, extraordinary kind. Most of this material was printed between 1510 and 1530. And it is particularly important to make this material available not only to scholars of engravings, but also to historians, because very little of it has been preserved. Since the broadsides documented current events, Their function was essential temporary. As a result, they were rarely kept and very few have survived. The one you can see on the left is the story in words and images of a miracle that took place in the Veneto hinterland, when the Madonna appeared to two peasants and asked them to build a chapel dedicated to her, a chapel that still exists today. Finally, on one of the aspects that give us the greatest satisfaction is when our records become the starting point for the research of other scholars. For instance, this is the case of a curious group of 5 antique woodcuts, Italian and German, that were glued to the back of a painting by the artist Leonard von Brixen. The painting was hung in the refectory of a monastery of Benedictine nuns close to Bruneck in South Tyrol. These woodcuts have been studied by a young scholar, Elisa Lonigro, who will surely publish an article about them. One of our main objectives is that our database should provide the groundwork for building a network in which historians of different disciplines can come into contact and engage in fruitful exchange. This is why we invite even scholars not directly involved in the project who have studied woodcuts that are missing from our catalog to compile the entry themselves. For instance, in the course of researching her degree dissertation on the Venetian printer Matteo Pagano, Francesca Bartolo came across a large broadside representing the remains of the tomb of Cicero on Zante, the Greek island that was a Venetian possession in the Renaissance. Her studies of this work unearthed a anxiety and ambiguous story that we couldn't afford to miss. We invite you to discover this antiquarian mystery in the entry that Francesca has written for the Census of Italian Renaissance woodcuts. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone. And I'm so honored to be here. I'm honored to be included among this illustrious panel. And I'm delighted to bring Elizabeth Catlett's work into this conversation about relief printmaking. I thank the organizers of today's Print Study Day for inviting me to join you here. So I'm now going to catapult us into the 20th century and talk about Elizabeth Catlett. And I'll tell you a little bit about her before I get into talking about several of her prints. Elizabeth Catlett is one of the most important American artists of the past century. She's honored as a foremother by subsequent generations in the United States and in Mexico, where she resided for over 60 years. And while she was there, she produced an unparalleled body of politically charged and aesthetically compelling graphic and sculptural images that were grounded in what she regarded as the historically based necessity to render visible Black women's lived experiences, which had rarely been the subject of art. She followed the advice of Grant Wood, her graduate school mentor, that she take as her subject what she knew best, as she dedicated herself to making art primarily for African-American and later Mexican audiences, determined to, as she said, put art to the service of people. Elizabeth Catlett was born in 1915 and she grew up in Washington, D.C. She was denied admission to Carnegie Technical Institute because of her race. She was admitted, and then when it was realized that she was African-American, she was told no. So she entered Howard University, where the art department was a locus of debate that encompassed aesthetics, imagery, and the sources of inspiration to which African-American art should rightly attend. She earned her bachelor's degree in art at Howard University in 1935, And then she taught for 2 years in the public schools in Durham, North Carolina. Then she decided to pursue graduate study at the University of Iowa, an environment quite different from Washington and Durham. She went to Iowa to study painting with Grant Wood, but sculpture became her focus, and she did a little bit of printmaking there as well. In 1940, she received the first Master of Fine Arts degree earned in sculpture at the University of Iowa. From 1940 until 1942, she taught at Dillard University in New Orleans, and then she moved to New York, where she became absorbed in the milieu of the city's leading African-American artists, musicians, and progressive intellectuals. Most significant for the future direction of her art was her work as promotion director and instructor of sculpture and sewing at the George Washington Carver School, a night school for the working people of Harlem. She was deeply moved, she said, by what she termed the cultural hunger of her students at the Carver School, and she was inspired by these students to seek a Julius Rosenwald Fund Fellowship to produce, as she wrote in her fellowship application, quote, a series of lithographs, paintings, and sculptures on the role of the Negro woman in the fight for democratic rights in the history of America, unquote. And we'll see that she actually didn't produce a series of lithographs, but she produced a fabulous series of lino cuts. During the first year of her fellowship, she made little progress. When her funding was renewed for a second year in 1946, Catlett and the artist Charles White, her husband at the time, went to Mexico. She intended to spend a year in Mexico. Instead, after a few months, she returned to the United States, ended that marriage, and returned in 1947 to make her home in Mexico. She became a member of the Taller de Gráfica Popular, and she married one of the workshop's members, the painter and printmaker Francisco Mora. They were artistic and life partners until Mora's death in 2002. I'm showing you here this pair of portraits of the two of them, so you can imagine them together as she's starting her life in Mexico. She also became the first woman professor of sculpture at Mexico's National Autonomous University, where she taught from 1959 until 1975. She continued to make prints and sculpture at her studio in Cuernavaca until shortly before her death in 2012. The Taller de Gráfica Popular was founded in 1937 as a graphic arts workshop to serve the Mexican people. Both meanings of the Spanish popular are implied by the workshop's name, which can be translated as popular or people's graphic arts workshop. The TGP, as it's often abbreviated, claimed roots in indigenous and popular culture and positioned itself as carrying on the lineage of people's art born of the Mexican Revolution. At its center was a much-loved printing press that bore the inscription Paris 1871 and was thus believed by many to have served the graphic artists of the Paris Commune. In their first decade, the TGP produced tens of thousands of images, mostly black and white lino cuts and some woodcuts and lithographs. And you're seeing the where some of these were viewed on street corners, like this photograph of a street corner in Mexico City, and that same image is echoed in the lino cut by Leopoldo Mendes on the left. These prints condemned fascism. They supported unions and national literacy programs and other forms of popular education. They affirmed solidarity with movements for social justice, and they celebrated the historical achievements of the Mexican people. They were printed by the thousands on thin newsprint quality paper, and they were sold inexpensively or given away. They were distributed throughout Mexico and internationally. Their realistic style and commonly understood iconography were also manifestations of TGP members' commitment to making their prints accessible to their viewers. The group held weekly meetings, and representatives of unions and other organizations would come to these meetings with requests for graphic images. Elizabeth Catlett later recalled, quote, somebody would come in and say, this is the situation in our organization or in our school or in our union, and this is the problem we have. Mexico at that time was something like 49% illiterate. So graphic art was very important, unquote. And you're seeing just a couple of examples of these prints. When Elizabeth Catlett arrived in Mexico, members of the TGP were immersed in the production of their renowned Prints of the Mexican Revolution. And this is a portfolio of 85 linocuts with narrative titles and explanatory text that honors heroes and martyrs of the Mexican Revolution in dramatic, expressive, realist images. The prints vary stylistically. Some of the artists favored bold, angular contour lines and dramatic contrasts of light and dark, while some employed intricately incised lines and textures to render figures and their surroundings in convincing detail. Many of these prints were based on well-known photographs. This was art made in service to the people. And what was crucial was the accessibility of these prints for people whose historical knowledge of the revolution, besides what they had experienced directly, was visual rather than textual. The TGP's Mexico Revolution series offered Catlett the means to envision her epic commemoration of the historic oppression, resistance, and survival of African-American women. This was her Negro Woman print series, later titled The Black Woman, that's now the best known part of the project that drew her to Mexico. So you're seeing here the series in its entirety, and we'll be seeing some of these images individually in a couple of moments as well. And the Metropolitan Museum holds a good bit of this series in their print collection, which is fabulous. So the series consists of 15 linoleum cuts accompanied by captions that prescribe the order of their viewing. And so I've arranged them in that order here. They're intimately scaled, about the size of an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. They're powerful prints that draw the viewer in close, because you have to get up close to see them because they're small. Throughout the series, the historically marginalized achievements of African-American heroines and the private realities of the lives of ordinary African-American women demand witness. The series commences with I Am the Negro Woman, now retitled I Am the Black Woman, and its accompanying titles invite us as viewers to identify with Catlett's subject as we voice this narrative. So I'll read you the narrative that accompanies these images. I am the Black woman. I have always worked hard in America, in the fields and in other folks' homes. I have given the world my songs. In Sojourner Truth, I fought for the rights of women as well as Blacks. In Harriet Tubman, I helped hundreds to freedom. In Phyllis Wheatley, I proved intellectual equality in the midst of slavery. My role has been important in the struggle to organize the unorganized. I have studied in ever-increasing numbers. My reward has been bars between me and the rest of the land. I have special reservations, special houses, and a special fear for my loved ones. My right is a future of equality with other Americans. So I am, my role, my right. We repeat as we read these titles, joining the artist in her identification with her subject through this insistent first-person declaration of a Black woman's subjectivity that echoes throughout the series narrative. Photographs produced for the US government's Farm Security Administration and published in Richard Wright's and Edwin Roskin's 1941 12 Million Black Voices, a folk history of the Negro in the United States, were sources for elements within several of the prints, emulating the TGP's practice of borrowing from well-known photographs. The subject and setting for I Have Always Worked Hard in America recalls this photograph by Jack Delano. In the Fields, the image of the sharecropper and her surroundings is drawn from one of Dorothea Lange's photographs documenting rural life in the US South. And you see here that Catlett emphasized the unending labor of this woman by the furrow behind her that recedes into the distance. That looks like it goes a long way back. And the woman enlarged becomes the focal point of this print. So we can see here how she worked from a photograph and then made the image her own. Catlett honored historical figures in this series. Abolitionist leader Sojourner Truth, and I'm showing you where this image came from. Harriet Tubman, who led hundreds of people to safety on the Underground Railroad. And Phyllis Wheatley, whose poems on various subjects, religious and moral, was the first book of poetry to be published by an African American. And again, the source of Catlett's image, which is from an engraving based on a drawing by Scipio Moorhead of this very important poet. She also invoked the steadfast endurance and courageous activism of countless women whose names have not been recorded and the weight of the burdens they carry, union organizers and women who hunger for education. Working women of the US South whose lives were made immensely more difficult by segregation, exhausted women in northern cities who faced overcrowded living conditions. In the lynching that she depicted in And a Special Fear for My Loved Ones, we don't see one of the women illustrated in all of the other prints in her series, but this print conveys Black women's unrelenting fear for the safety of those they love. And the final image in the series is one of determination. My right is a future of equality with other Americans. Catlett later reprinted this series, replacing some of the blocks that had apparently been damaged or lost with similar but not identical images. And this is something that often perplexes and confounds collectors when they're trying to figure out when each of these prints may have been made. And that was relatively unimportant to Catlett because it was really about making prints when they were needed or as people wanted them. By 1948, she was exhibiting as a member of the Taller de Gráfico Popular. Her prints included images of heroes of the Mexican Revolution and the struggles and achievements of Mexico's rural and urban working people, predominantly women. As she gained fluency in the lino cut medium, her style became virtually indistinguishable from that of other TGP members. Her lino cut The Mexican People in the Ranks of Peace, which appeared on the cover of the newsletter of the Mexican peace organization Paz, proclaimed her solidarity with the international peace movement. In Bread or the Right to Eat, the textural hatchings that fill the entire surface of this lino cut show us various textures, various materials, various substances in this print. The carefully rendered details and the round, solid modeling of the figure and the gradations of light and dark that she achieved with these subtle variations in the carving of the linoleum block are characteristic of TGP lino cuts. Cosechadora de algodón, or sharecropper, is one of Catlett's most celebrated lino cuts. Initially, she printed it in black and white, as you see here, and some early proofs also include experiments with color. In its subtly varied, closely spaced hatching, she delineated contour, substance, texture, and pattern. And in this way, her incising of the linoleum block for sharecropper reflects the fluency that she developed in this medium at the TGP. At the same time, the expressive angularity of the woman's careworn face marks sharecropper as kin to many of her earlier depictions of African-American women workers. The monumentality of the image's compositional focus and vantage point, seen from below, are emblematic of the respect Catlett felt her subject deserved. With images like this one, she deliberately countered racist stereotypes and misinformation about African Americans that were seen all too often in US and US dominated Mexican media. Now, at this time in the 1950s, Like other US leftist expatriates in Mexico, Catlett was subjected intermittently to harassment by the US Embassy. Her decision to seek Mexican citizenship came after she was forcibly taken from her home by Mexican authorities and imprisoned as a foreign agitator during a railroad workers' strike in 1959. Her arrest and the arrest of many other people were part of a move by the Mexican and US governments to suppress labor and the left, including the arrest and deportation of many US citizens living in Mexico who had been designated as communist by the US Embassy. Soon after she was released from prison, she applied for Mexican citizenship to avoid further mistreatment and possible deportation. She became a Mexican citizen in 1962, and she was immediately labeled an undesirable alien by US authorities because of her apparent political affinities. And this is important as we think about this print, because this meant that she was prohibited from traveling to the United States throughout the 1960s. And it was in the late 1960s when this print became iconic of Elizabeth Catlett's work and was reprinted. And it was reprinted in color. I'll show you that in a moment. From her vantage point in Mexico, unable to enter the United States, she refocused her attention on movements for justice in the United States. And she shared with revolutionary Black artists here what she had learned in Mexico about art making as a praxis of solidarity activism. She felt a profound connection to the promise of Black nationalism and the visual politics of the Black arts movement, which is the visual manifestation of the Black Power movement. And many of her prints and also her sculpture from these years affirmed her solidarity with the civil rights and Black Power movements, particularly emphasizing the role of women in these movements. So in the 1960s, sharecropper resonated in this context. As I said, she first printed sharecropper in 1952, and she printed it again in several open-ended editions. You'll notice there are no edition numbers on this print. And this is because she returned to this print when it was called for and when it called to her. In the late 1960s, at the height of the Black Power movement, she added color, colors associated with African liberation movements and Black liberation in the United States, decisively marking this figure as a woman of African descent. And the colors sometimes varied a little bit in their intensity depending on when she was printing from this block. Though she left the TGP in 1966, Catlett's prints continue to manifest her commitment to printmaking as a democratizing art practice, a commitment that germinated and flowered during her years as a member of the Taller Gráfico Popular. These are not prints that were made to hold value as rarefied objects made in limited editions. They're the opposite. They were made to serve the needs of her audience. So she printed and reprinted them as often as necessary. As she said of what she learned as a member of the Taller Gráfico Popular, I learned to put art to the service of people. In 1970, Catlett was honored as an Elder of Distinction at the Conference on the Functional Aspects of Black Art, or CONFABA, held at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois. She was denied a visa to attend, so she spoke to her audience by phone from Mexico. And of course, they didn't have Zoom yet, or she would have probably appeared the way we are all together here. Her statement was an unequivocal affirmation of her solidarity with the Black liberation struggle and of the revolutionary potential of art. And also it proclaimed her profound identification with the liberatory vision and praxis of her fellow Mexican artists. And I want to share her concluding words with you here. She said, I want to say a final word about the love we should have for our Black brothers and sisters, to live with them, learn from them, create from them, and give to them of our art only the best. Our people deserve no less. Let's create the best art possible for the liberation of our beautiful Black people. In her later years, Catlett returned to themes seen in her earlier work, and to the TGP practice of working from photographs to ensure the legibility of her images. In Survivor, which is in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, she looked to a photograph by Dorothea Lange that to Catlett spoke of determination, perseverance, resistance, the physical and psychic toll of the intersecting race, class, and gender oppressions experienced by Black working women, and against all odds, these women's survival. And you're seeing here the photograph that she used as the basis for this lino cut. A comparison with In the Fields from her earlier series, now titled The Black Woman, demonstrates both the continuity of her vision and her commitment, as she said, to put art to the service of people, and her mastery of the lino cut as an expressive medium during her decades of affiliation with the Taller Gráfico Popular. Both of these prints are based on Farm Security Administration photographs by Dorothea Lange. In the Fields, more faithful to its source, and Survivor distilled from the photograph to highlight the woman's careworn face and her posture that evinces both strength and exhaustion. Lange's background in Survivor is minimized and abstracted so that our focus is the woman, rendered with the assured incising of lines that vary in thickness and density to convey both materiality and empathy. We see the marks of various incising tools to render the angular creases in her sleeves, the folds of her headscarf, the looser weave of her apron that contrasts with the darker garment she's wearing, the tension in her hands, the contours of her face, the physical substance and the weighty presence of this woman, and the feeling of what she has endured and survived. In a symposium at the University of Texas in 1975, the Mexican painter and printmaker Rufino Tamayo claimed that truly revolutionary painting takes new stylistic paths, and that the utilization of social or political content to call one's art revolutionary is meaningless. Tamayo's statement was published in the Mexico City newspaper Excelsior. Catlett wrote a response that was published the following week in the newspaper El Dia, in which she argued that Mexican murals and what she called social printmaking were revolutionary precisely because of their content. Artists have a powerful obligation, she asserted, to expose abuses of power and the perpetuation of injustice, illuminate resistance, and stimulate revolutionary awareness in service to social transformation. And so this is the purpose of these democratizing, sometimes editionless prints that we've been looking at here. Art cannot effect this change, she concluded, but it can raise consciousness of the necessities and the possibilities of doing so. Throughout her long career, Catlett's printmaking was impelled by this imperative to illuminate resistance, call out injustice, raise consciousness, and envision a more just and equitable world. Prints made, as she said, for liberation and for life. Thank you, and I look forward to further discussion after we've heard from our next speaker.
I would like to thank the IFPDA and my colleagues, the Met, for organizing and hosting this event and inviting me to speak. I would also like to acknowledge that I'm presenting this talk on Munsee, Lenape, and Wapinger lands and recognize the longstanding significance of the land to these nations past and present. I'm talking today on lino cuts, also known as linoleum cuts or linoleum prints. And these are primarily a 20th century medium. And by exploring the visual language produced both by the materials as well as the printing processes is really what we're going to explore today to see how different artists in different areas use these. Linoleum or the lino cuts of this 20th century medium, primarily because we're talking about the matrix of linoleum, which was, as this advert says, and I love the phrase, the inventive mind and a can of paint left open by accident were the co-founders of this great linoleum industry. Its manufacture is as strange as its origin. And this inventive mind to whom they're referring is Frederick Walton, who noticed it as the story goes in the mid-1850s, that a strong film a rubbery water-resistant film was left on top of a can of paint that was left open. And that this thick film was a result of drying via oxidation and could produce these sheets that you could then add some colorant and some other fillers and resin, as well as back it onto either burlap or jute and produce this tough covering. And it was also been able to make patterns. And because it was machine manufactured, it was inexpensive. And almost from its patent date in 1862 into the 1950s, it became a dominant flooring material in many places in the United States and Europe, as well as around the world. And after the 1950s, although it was still called linoleum erroneously, it really got replaced by some later plastics. But the first factories were in Scotland and England, and then it went to Germany, and then in the early 20th century in the United States. And in this picture I'm showing you here on the left, you can see a variety of colors, that sort of classic granite that you often see. The roll in the center at the top, the gray, is a type of linoleum which is referred to as battleship linoleum. It was actually meant to line the floors of, in fact, battleships, and it could be up to a ½ an inch thick. It was incredibly durable material. And you can also see the more characteristic blocks in the lower center, which is what, many people, including myself, when they're in, elementary school, learn printmaking and get to experiment with cutting these blocks. And you can see an advertisement here from 1928 with the more decorative flooring that was very, very popular in the early and mid part of the 20th century. The process of making a lino cut starts with a block, and you can see a sheet in the upper left, but you can also see in two of these slides that it's often mounted to a piece of wood because it's so flexible and so able to be moved. It's very hard to carve, so it often gets mounted to the block, and it is being carved in the upper right, and you can see then in the lower left it gets inked, often with a brayer, and it is a relief process, as you all know and we just talked about, so that the top of the linoleum, what is not carved away, is what gets printed. The printed blocks are laid face up, and then the paper laid on top of it, and then it's often can be run through a press, but because of the nature of the linoleum and the nature of the relief print, it can also be printed by hand or with something called a baron. You can see in the slide on the right, this small leaf wrapped material here. This is a very early use of linoleum as a matrix material for this poster. It is also, as you can see from the media line, it's also hand applied color. And what it really shows here is two parts of linoleum printing, which are characteristic. You can get very smooth lines. You can also get fairly large dimensions without the weight. And here in these details, you can see the green leaves are in fact hand painted, but the yellow is also applied as a separate block of linoleum. And on the slide on the left around the face, you can see, what I hope you can see, is along these edges where the block that contained the yellow sort of hides itself in this black. And this black is often referred to as a key block, type of printing design structure by which you can sort of hide the seams of the colors as well as define the shapes and the forms through this block. But you can also clearly see that it's a relief type of print, and you can see along this edge here on the detail of the bottom that there is this ink squash that is characteristic of all relief prints. When they press upon the paper, that they move a little bit of the ink that is on the blocks to the edges of the cut blocks. And linoleum prints came at a time which was not terrifically divorced from some other types of printing processes that were having either rebirth or re-expressions of how they were used, one of which of course is woodcut. And I think you can see from this Albers lino cut, sorry, I forgot the media line, but the lino cut, how that language can be seen coming through, with one of the biggest differences is the background. And I show you these three as a comparison, that the Albers on the right, while it has some of the language of the of the Schmidt-Rohloff and the Munch, in terms of you can see the lines of the knife or the chisel or the gouge, particularly in these areas in the face. But the background, you can see, does not have any of the wood pattern that you can see fairly well in this print, and actually beautifully allowed to shine in this in the Munch. As I mentioned, because it did become a popular art that was often considered to be something you could use, to learn about art, or you could have in schools. It became highly marketed as an arts learning technique for schools, that companies, for instance, sold these box sets of these gouges and knives in different shapes and forms that you could use to cut linoleum. Linoleum was soft enough that actually Claude Flight, who was one of the founders of the Grosvenor School, who really championed lino cut, said you could use an umbrella ribs. You could just cut something out to sort of gouge away. And often wood cutting tools were sold to work with these, but you could mar it fairly easily, which allowed for a lot of expression in how artists use this medium. You can see here in this Matisse lino cut the amazing fluidity that you can get through linoleum and a knife, and it responds to the pressure of the knife and responds to the curvature of the hand. And artists like Matisse liked it for its being able to capture the gesture that they were used to expressing, say, with a drawing medium, such as a pen or a charcoal or a crayon. And I'm showing these two as a comparison. In the lower left, there is a detail of the Kirchner Junkerboden, and you can see that there is this attempt, and this successful attempt, to make these curved lines of the landscape. But as this is a woodcut, you can see some of the start and stop, some of the less than smooth linearity to the lines. Whereas on the right, the Sybil Andrews, it just shines with the ability to make these swooping, smooth, continuous lines. And also this really curved, I sometimes call puddling, but this very curved holes, shall we say, or puddling in the linoleum, which you see a lot actually when you start looking at linoleum, because these holes are very characteristic of the super soft outlines that one gets when cutting with linoleum. But I also think it's amazing how well the softness and the directness of it can almost look like a painting media. This is a multicolored lino cut, and you can see how it very much looks like either a paint, or even at times to me like a monoprint. It has that fluidity that is really hard to reproduce in other types of print making. As Melanie talked about wonderfully about the Mexican El Taller Gráfica Popular, it was used there as well as a material. It was inexpensive, and it lent itself to this idea of prints for the people and a democratizing force, because it was not an expensive material. Plus, it relied on less, not fine skill, but less carving skills to really be able to produce the images that the artist desired. And I think this was a very important part in looking at the Grosvenor School prints, which was, as I said, founded by Claude Flight in the early 1920s in London, and produced these multicolored prints through the 20s and 30s. And like other types of multicolored prints, this one did rely on multiple sheets of linoleum to make these colors. And the Grosvenor School too liked it because it was cheap and accessible, but they also liked this idea that this inexpensiveness, as well as the ease of carving, was about freeing creativity, as well as divorcing the idea that the craft by which you had to study, that potentially meant going to, more training, more school, more things that were potentially barred for certain people to go to art school per se, or go to learn wood carving, that you could do this more freely, and it creatively freed you to judge the quality of the art by how the artist expressed things, not by how well they could carve a block. And so that was a very interesting part of the way that they looked at linoleum. And it's an interesting note to say, by the way, that it's also during this period that linoleum itself was doing what wallpapers were doing through the late 19th and early 20th century. They were making faux bois, faux marbre, granite, mosaics, and tiles. And so the idea of linoleum not just being inexpensive, but part of this whole movement of accessibility to visual culture that was not part of what most people could afford previously was tied into these ideas about using linoleum. So here's an example of 4 blocks by Sybil Andrews, and it's the idea that, which many color printmaking processes use, is 1 color per block. And you can see here how, if you look at the print on the left, you can start to compare left to right of how the planning has to go into this to make sure that the colors not just line up, but also can create the shades and tones that were desired. And to be able to do this, you know, for all the idea that this did not require a technical skill, they were very skilled in being able to see the vision and be able to put together the layers of color and the layers of texture, and making sure that the transparencies were in the right order so that you could affect light, shadow, dappled surfaces, colored surfaces, saturated surfaces versus unsaturated surfaces. And in this print by Lily Chudi, one of the things I'm also showing you, by the way, that most of these prints were all intended to be only shown to this border, but I'm allowing you in this presentation to sort of see the whole sheet so you can get a better sense of when these are being printed, sort of the outside that might have the paint or the hands or the inks and the marks, but how cleanly and well done and registered that these prints were in the area that you're supposed to see. To be able to make these various prints, and I'll just go back for a moment to this, for instance, Sybil Andrews used a homemade carbon paper. So she would take her drawing and be able to then reproduce it 4 times on 4 different blocks so that the carving would all be the same. If you look at this example here, you can see some of the remnants of the homemade carbon paper markings on the linoleum block that were left uncarved in this particular block. Lily Chudi actually did extensive work, and I'll show you both recto and verso of the preparatory drawing for this print, by which she would be able to work on both sides, which gave the advantage of being able to work on your design in the orientation by which you were planning on having the final impression, but also be able to get a sense of color and a way to transfer the design. So what she did in this example, you can see, is that there's a fairly well worked out color scheme. And then you can see here remnants of 2 drawings. First, a sketch that you can see in this very light, behind the sort of light lines you can see behind, primarily in the margins, but then there's a very heavy embossed line, which is how this drawing was transferred to the blocks through a heavy impression of a stylus, which left a mark into the soft linoleum. And here's 2 proofs, which meant that each of the blocks were printed to look at their results, to see how they printed, how the lines printed. And one of the important things to see about these 2 proofs is that there is no black line, there is no key block. And that was a very important part of this Grosvenor School's take on printmaking, was that they were trying to divorce themselves from the idea that it was just a colored in black and white. They wanted to produce full color prints that were born from fields of color. And so you can see here on the right the overall print, and on the left of a detail that the heads and the forms and the newspapers, yes, of course there are some dark areas, there are some black areas that help define like the strap hangers and some of the details of the figures and the papers, but this composition, the lights, the shadows, the forms, the details, and the patterning was in fact created from a very sophisticated overlap of colors. And just to sort of reiterate what I'm talking about the key block, you can see here on the bottom, it's just a didactic about what key blocks do, but you print fields of color, and then it's really the black block which gives you the design, which gives you the sense of the form. And it was also a practice found in Japanese woodcuts, which were popular in this period as well. And you can see here how important having this key block or this black outline was for both of these images. The other thing that was very important to the Grosvenor School was actually to remove themselves from the woodblock, the Japanese woodblock particularly, but the idea that the woodblock, both European and Japanese, were something that they were often confused with technically or sometimes compared to, and they wanted to be unabashedly a lino cut print. This is the example of a contemporary with the Grosvenor School, beautiful woodcut by Blanche Lozelle, but you can see how not only is the wood allowed to sort of shine through, as you can see here, through all the grain, which enhances the design, but that there are these pale colors, that they're still very much restricted to areas of space, and that there's not a lot of overlap in both this as well as in the Japanese print or the moose that you see below you here. And what they were working on was to put together fields of color. And so I'm going to show you a group of details from a beautiful print called The Eight by Cyril Powers. And the little red square shows you the area that I'm highlighting, but you can see how there's no black lines, that there's no outline of the forms. And although when you look at this print, you might think that the rowers on the right side have black heads and they're all rowing with black oars, that is actually the combination of all the colors in the print laid together to affect a black, which to distinguish it from the blue or the orange or the red. So there is no black block in this particular printmaking. And here's another example, and you can see also how important the transparency was, in addition to the very precise lining up of the different colors to make what looks like black. And you can see that sort of here, that it's the orange and the green and the blue. And a very, very close detail to really show the importance of the transparency and the order of layering to get the effects that were desired in terms of shimmering shades, in this case of bright yellow, a dimmer orange, and maybe even a darker orange on the blue water. And Stanley Hayter continued this method by using very sinuous lines that come from the lino cut, as well as using the transparency and the layering, not any type of black line block, to make the design. In the block, but not only in the block making, but also in the proofing, there's lots of experimental proofs that were made by the Grosvenor School, experimenting with what it looks like to have different colors, different combinations of colors, as well as different ordering of colors. And this is a experimental print, an only copy, using just two blocks, the yellow block and the green, using the yellow and the blue blocks. And you'll see in the next slide, when you add the green and the red, how it changes it, but also how important it is to have this layering. On the right side here, you can see this wrinkling going on. And this is important to this group of printmakers because they were using Japanese papers a lot in their practice, particularly a gampi paper, which is very, very thin, very, very silky, and has this amazing sort of diaphanous, light sharing, light reflecting type of paper. And it's been popular with printmakers for hundreds of years because these papers soak in differently, they impress differently when you're printing on them. And it became a type of paper, but also papers that in general really exploited the linoleum cut methods. And you can see here in a piece called Brooklands that it's a two-layered print, and the top layer, as you can see on the left, has the printed color, but the underlayer is this very, very thin paper with these silver inclusions, and they are mounted together so that you get this billowy moving surface by which shows this sparkling silver sort of peeking through the top layer. And it's an amazing sort of an idea about capturing movement, not just through your design, but also through the actual physical movement of the work of art. And that is one of the hard things about having this presentation virtual and not having the art in front of you, is that these have a palpable physical presence. They are relief prints. They have the ink squash. They have difference in gloss and difference in texture, which can be really hard to capture on the screen. And it's not just the Grosvenor School, but I find that across many practitioners of linoleum cuts, that they can really push and exploit the textural differences that you can achieve with this type of relief printing. Here's another example just of what this really thin paper can do for you, was that the Claude Flight mounted this print onto a very, very bright yellow card. And so this yellow nature comes through, and you can see it coming through in many areas of this print. This is actually an early Claude Flight print from 1922. And this is when he is still relying heavily on the key block, which by the 1930s disappears. But you can see how important it is in this design for creating the forms and the features of both the busts and the backgrounds. The other thing this very thin paper allowed him and others to do is to print on both sides. And this is a really good example where the red here and on this man's head is printed on the side that you're looking at, whereas the red of the buses and of the more background features is printed on the back. And so you see it shining through the paper, giving two effects to the same amount, the same color print. As I mentioned, you do get characteristics of relief printing. You can see here, for instance, the ink squash. You can see, which is along here, you can see the well-defined forms. But one of the interesting things about these printmakers is that they started using oil paints, and the oil paints were thicker. It gave them a lot of flexibility in terms of texture and patterning, and also because these were printed by hand, and they were sort of printed on demand, but the idea being that they did have, unlike the group we just heard about, the TGP, these were printed on demand, but to an edition of often 50 or 60. And but sometimes the whole edition was not printed, but there were really careful notes about not only where the, who was printing them, but how each edition was printed. What type of red, not just that it's red, but which type of brand name, how much pressure to put on each color in each area. And because these were printed by hand, even though they are printed as an edition and as a multiple, they can be highly different impression to impression to impression for this reason. In this next couple slides, I just want to show you the variety of textures that you can get using various papers and these oil paints. And you can see here everything from this very thin, almost tinted background with this interweb of darker ink to this pebbling pattern with some of the overlap that you can see here that is important to the design. This shows this much, much thicker, darker ink and the edge, the ink squash from the relief print. And this is just a close-up of printed on the front and printed on the back to sort of show you the differences in tone. And another set of slides also just to further show the variety that one can get and the importance of whether the paints chosen were transparent or opaque. And I will point out that this, sorry, the picture's a little blurry, but this black line here, this loop streak here, is in fact the one of this group that is printed in printing ink, and it's much blacker and much glossier and has much less texture in terms of thickness than the oil paints. And then of course there was using textured linoleum. And textured linoleum here you can see what adds a wonderful addition to using linoleum as the matrix. I wanted to show off a few other types of linoleum cuts that are well known, but that have some interesting sort of quirks. One is this really well known still life by lamplight by Picasso, and it's called a reductive lino cut, which is rather than having multiple blocks for each color, you carve a block, you print it, you take some more linoleum out, you re-ink it in a different color, you print it right on top of what you've already printed, and you keep going and going. So you are in fact removing more and more from the actual lino block as you continue to print. And obviously much planning has to go in so you know where to leave and where to remove at which stage of the printing. And because you're destroying your block per se, or you're destroying your earlier color prints of it, you have to be precise, and you also only get to do it sort of in a very definitive run. You can see here in this still from this British Museum video, and I will put the link for that in the chat or the Q&A in a moment. But you can see many of the proof that he did in different colors while this print was being produced. Chuck Close also attempted this reduction technique in this really large, you can see how large this was, print, and it started his life as a reductive lino cut. And he was using the Battleship linoleum because it had huge big rolls. You could get an expanse that was 72 by 58, but they had lots of problems with both the dimensions of the linoleum and also the registration. Believe it or not, even though it was one block, the registration was causing problems getting the multiple print attempts, multiple reductive attempts down on a piece of paper. What Chuck Close did, which was interesting with his printmaking studio, was that rather than printing proofs on paper, he printed them on Mylar. Part of that, of course, is that when you're looking at how you're progressing, you can pile them up and get a sense of the transparency. And it was such a failure in trying to print the linoleum, he ended up using the Mylars to then create screen print templates and print this as a screen print. So it's an interesting sort of deconstruction, reconstruction, because you start with one matrix, you made a series of multiple matrices, and then you printed as one impression. And MoMA has a book that you can read online that details a lot of this making of this particular print. And I also just wanted to show this lino cut by Picasso. Picasso is very creative. I mean, that's an understatement, but he's very creative with his materials in that he can push and explore and feel all the possibilities. And I think this is just an amazing use of almost using linoleum, treating it like a mezzotint, in that you have to remove enough to get the strong highlights on her cheeks, and that you scrape away almost like one in other printmaking processes that are reductive, to be able to leave highlights in what otherwise would be an all black printed background. And this, of course, also has then a more solid, you can see here, the carved layer of ink. And I just want to finish with a couple of other examples of how lino cut gets used by itself or with other media, and how it can both be really expressive and can cover large areas, and has this ability to be used in a wide variety of ways, from what I consider a very drawing sort of technique here to one might say a very printmaking technique here, in that you see the remnants of the knife and the carving heavily in the image. What you don't get from this on the screen is that this is the inkiest media on this very soft Japanese paper, and it makes just this unbelievable contrast between the dark ink and the white fluffy paper that just it enhances the whole feeling of poverty and fatigue in a way that is very palpable when you're seeing this in person. And I really love the use of this one by Kara Walker, because the soft linoleum not only gave her a very, very large canvas, as I had mentioning, but gave the ability to carve out an incredible amount of very soft details, which are essential to making this print. And finally, this suite of prints by Atakwami, which I love because there's no more line, there's almost no more sense of carving, which is so important to linoleum, but it still has this sense of fields of color, which we've seen before, but also the sense of handmadeness and a direct hand of the artist, which is very significant and important part of these linoleum prints. So I would like to say thank you to everyone, and to this exploration of this amazing matrix.
Thank you, Rachel. Great. Thank you so much, everyone. This has been absolutely fascinating. Every single talk brought out different interesting aspects of relief prints and really fascinating material. We are running a little bit over time, so I am going to address a question to each of the speakers that's come in while you were speaking. And unfortunately, we don't have time for a long question session. So it's too bad because everything was really interesting, especially for us print geeks. So for Sylvia, Rocco Piccinino asks, have you been successful in including those works in private hands? How are you approaching this effort? So do you have works from private collections in the database?
And yes, whenever we find a work in a private collection, we include it. But the problem is we have not a lot of private collector of woodcuts. For instance, there is the important collection of Alberto Milano, that was one of the most important scholars of popular print. And thanks to his widow, we could catalog his collection in the database. And we also auction houses, of course, sell woodcuts that become from private collection, and we include them to the database. Unfortunately, we don't have so private collector, but we hope that maybe when we spread the census worldwide, private collector will contact us.
Are you still adding to the database, or is it mostly finished?
Yes. We are continuing adding woodcuts, and we travel all over Italy, Europe, and we are going to come also to the USA to add other woodcuts.
Okay, we look forward to seeing you. For Melanie, Lisa Matthias asked, what was the distribution of the Elizabeth Catlett series from 46 to 47 like at the time? Like the other Mexican ones shown, was it pasted up on road corners and handed out free or inexpensively in Mexico and the US?
That is a great question. And that series, because it was part of her Rosenwald Fellowship work, traveled to the United States. It was exhibited at the Barnett Aiden Gallery in Washington, D.C., and then at several other venues in the U.S. South. And then prints from that series were either sold or given away, many ending up in the hands of her friends and colleagues. It wasn't printed widely enough to be pasted all over street corners. That was really more what the TGP did with prints that were addressing more kind of topical, immediate political and social themes. So they didn't have that purpose, but they were distributed and ended up mostly, I think, in private collections. The series now, there are very few institutions that have a full run of the series. I know the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts has it in their Linda Lee Alter collection. The Memphis Brooks Museum has it. And other museums like the Met, for example, has part of the series, but not all of it. Hopefully it will be reassembled. There's a major retrospective of Elizabeth Catlett being planned that East Coast folks, you'll have a couple of East Coast venues for that. So hopefully that series will be brought together there. But it was, you know, she wasn't famous yet. And so the idea that people would see this as something to grab onto wasn't really an idea at that point. So it was really more that the series made its hands into historically Black colleges, libraries, the Barnett Aiden collection, and friends.
Okay, great. Rachel, I think you answered some of this, but what types of inks were used for these multi-layered lino cuts?
So primarily they're all oil-based inks. for the most part. I mean, there are some exceptions out there, but these are oil-based. The biggest difference is that most of the printmaking, the Picasso ones and the very early one from the Lark I showed you, are printing inks, whereas the ones from the Grosvenor School are actually tube oil paints. And while they are all oil-based and made of linseed and colors and pigments, they do not have the same properties. They are actually made for different working properties. And so they appear very differently and they behave very differently during the printing process.
Great, thank you. So unfortunately, IFPDA has a hard cutoff that we have to stick to. This has been such a fascinating session. I can tell you, you've inspired at least one artist in the group to go out and buy some linoleum. So it's worked. And I really encourage everybody to come see the exhibition that we have opening on November 1st here at the Met of the Grosvenor School linoleum cuts, among other things. And thank you all for joining us. So, and thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.